Today I want to talk about one of the most neglected truths and doctrines in the Bible. And it is the doctrine of the command of faith. See, listen, there are two modes of speech. There is the prayer of faith. The prayer of faith is when you ask God to do something and you have expectation that He will do that. But the highest mode of speech is not the prayer of faith, it is the command of faith. And what's the difference? The command of faith is when the believer, acting in God's place, speaks to the obstacle and tells that obstacle to be removed from one's life. That obstacle could be sickness or lack or poverty or marital difficulty, but that believer begins to speak to the problem and orders that problem to disappear. And it is that command of faith that is the highest level of faith that is known in the world today. Yet today, many people only know about the prayer of faith. Today, you're going to learn about the command of faith. And you find it here in Exodus chapter 14. Let's look at verse 13. This is Moses. He's at the foot of the Red Sea. The Egyptians are right behind. The people are crying out, "Oh God, help us, we're going to die. The Egyptians are going to slaughter us. And we have nowhere to run. The Red Sea is before us." So everyone's crying out. And as they're crying out for help, we find in verse 13, Moses answered the people, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." Now watch this. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on. Raise your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea to divide the waters so the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground." Now, anybody notice? It almost sounds heretical. God says, verse 15, "Why are you crying out to me? Why are you asking me to help you?" Because at first it's like, well, isn't that what we're supposed to do when we're in trouble? We're supposed to ask God to help us. But here God says, "Why are you doing it? You've cried out long enough to me. You've asked enough help. It is time for you to move on. It's time to move forward. Moses, stretch out your staff. You split the Red Sea. You do something about it." See, I believe there are times when God says, "I've had enough of your prayers." Oh. Especially when we keep crying out for the same thing. "God, heal me, Lord. Oh, bless me. Give me a job. Oh, bless my marriage. Touch my husband. Make him godly. He's such a bad man. Please change him. God, help me. Help." And God says, "Why do you keep crying out? It is time for you to stretch forth your hand. It is time for you to take authority." And here we find an example of God saying, no more prayers. It's time to operate in the highest form of speech. And it is the command of faith. Command those waters to split before you. Now, this idea of the command of faith is found in the teachings of Christ. Go over to Mark chapter 11. Mark 11, this idea of the command of faith. That means the believer takes the place of Christ, stands in his shoes, and then does what he would do in that same or similar situation. In Mark 11, Jesus is coming back from Jerusalem. Actually going to Jerusalem, and it says in verse 22, "Have faith in God," Jesus answered. Verse 23, "I tell you the truth, if anyone says to this mountain, 'Go throw yourself into the sea,' and does not doubt in his heart, but believes that what he says will happen, it will be done for him." Jesus is telling us We can speak to the mountain. We can tell the mountain, mountain, I don't like you there. I want you to move from here to over here. You are in my way. What could that mountain be? That mountain is anything that opposes God's will for your life. God's will that you live a long and fruitful life. And maybe a cancer has fastened itself upon you. And you look and think, man, I'm going to die and I'm just a young person. That cancer is a mountain. What do? You can keep crying out, asking God to heal you, and that's okay. That's fine. But do you hear the Lord whispering? Why do you keep crying out? It is now time for you to talk to the mountain. And you tell the mountain, you tell the cancer, cancer, I don't like you in my body. You will have to get out of my body and you go over to the sea. Just get out right now. That's the command of faith. Jesus taught this. Now, if he just had taught this one time, we might have said that this was kind of like a minor teaching of Christ. But when you look at the synoptic gospels, that's Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you'll find this teaching found in all three of the gospels. But what's interesting is they're found in three different incidences in Jesus' life. In other words, most of the Gospels, when they record the same, they might record the same story. Maybe they have a little different change to it, but generally it's the same story being told by the different authors. But we're going to look that this teaching of speaking to mountains wasn't just given one time and the other Gospels just repeated the story. They actually show that Jesus taught this at different incidences and different times in his own ministry. Let me show you what I mean. We saw Mark. Mark is when he's coming from Jerusalem to Jerusalem. And now Matthew 17, let's look at Matthew 17. That's the gospel before Mark. Matthew 17. We're going to look at verse 20. This is right after Jesus had cured the boy that had a demon that was causing him to have seizures. Jesus drove out the demons. The disciples in verse 19 said, why couldn't we drive out the demon? So this is a different situation. Is that not right? The other one, he's traveling on a road. But here, he just cast out a demon. Now, verse 20, Jesus replied to them why they couldn't drive out demons. Because you have so little faith. I tell you the truth. If you had faith as small as a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move. Nothing will be impossible for you. Now, we all would say, if I told you, finish this sentence, for nothing shall be impossible for, most people would say God. Am I right? But Jesus said, nothing will be impossible for you. See, the prayer of faith is when you're asking the impossible, the God to do the impossible, but the command of faith is when you take God's place and you act like he would act in the situation so that his divine power is released through you. Now, granted, it's the same God that's doing the miracle. Whether or not you're asking God to do the miracle or whether you're speaking to the mountain. If the mountain moves, it's still God who moves the mountain, but he's doing it through you.